Before the waters rose, they had a plan. Not God's plan, theirs. What if the flood wasn't only judgment on man's sin, but the only way to stop something the watchers had already set in motion? Scripture hints at it. Few ever ask the question. Genesis 6 opens with a sentence so strange that most readers slide right past it. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. 4 verses. That's all Moses gives us before the world changes forever. But buried inside those 4 verses is a decision that theologians have argued over for 2,000 years, and it isn't really about marriage at all. It's about a plan. A calculated, deliberate plan carried out by beings who were never supposed to leave their post. The Book of Enoch names them directly. 200 watchers, angelic beings assigned to observe humanity from the heights of Mount Hermon, made a pact together. Not a fall from weakness, a conspiracy. Semjaza, their leader, feared taking this step alone, so he bound the others to him with an oath, because he knew what he was about to do could not be undone. That detail matters more than people realize. This wasn't temptation catching angels off guard. This was strategy. These were beings with knowledge of the heavens, of the stars, of things hidden from human eyes, and they chose to bring that knowledge down to earth wrapped inside a much darker intention. Why does this matter to you and me sitting here thousands of years later? Because what happened next didn't just corrupt a generation. It nearly erased the entire human story before it had a chance to unfold the way God intended. The offspring of these unions were not ordinary children. Enoch describes them as Nephilim, giants whose size and strength set them apart from every human who came before them. But size wasn't the danger. Appetite was. Scripture and the extra-biblical record agree on this point with unsettling consistency. These beings consumed everything in their path. Enoch records that when the produce of men could no longer sustain them, they turned against the people themselves, devouring what little remained, and mankind began to starve under the weight of creatures never meant to exist. Think about what that means. This wasn't simply moral decay, the kind of gradual drift into sin that Scripture describes in other ages. This was engineered collapse, a deliberate seeding of the human bloodline with something that didn't belong there, something designed, whether by pride, by rebellion, or by a colder calculation we may never fully understand, to overwhelm and consume the very creation God had called good. Consider the timeline for a moment. Adam to Noah spans roughly 16 centuries in the traditional reckoning, generation after generation living, dying, passing faith and memory down the line. And then, in what appears to be a single compressed window of history, something breaks the pattern entirely. The genealogies slow down, the narrative shifts from names and ages to catastrophe. Whatever the watchers set in motion didn't unfold gradually over centuries the way human sin usually spreads. It happened fast, almost as if it had been planned to reach critical mass before anyone could stop it. And the watchers didn't stop there. Azazel, one of the named leaders among them, is credited in Enoch with teaching men the making of swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, along with the art of war itself. He taught women the working of metals for ornament, the use of cosmetics, the beautifying of the eyelids, and with it came seduction, vanity, and bloodshed on a scale the earth had never absorbed before. Knowledge that should have elevated humanity instead became the very tool of its unraveling. This is the part few preachers ever mention on a Sunday morning. The fall in Genesis 3 was disobedience. What happened in Genesis 6 was infiltration. Jude, writing centuries later under inspiration, doesn't soften any of this. He describes angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day. Notice the language. Kept not their first estate, left their own habitation. This is not poetic imagery for ordinary human sin. This is the language of trespass, of beings crossing a boundary they were never meant to cross. And Jude places this account right alongside Sodom and Gomorrah as a warning of what happens when creation rebels against the order its creator established. It's a strange pairing if you stop to think about it, a city destroyed for human wickedness, set next to an angelic rebellion that predates it by centuries. Jude wants his readers to see them as two branches of the same root. Creation, whether angelic or human, stepping outside the boundary its creator set and reaping consequences that echo across generations. Peter confirms it too, writing that God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness, to be reserved unto judgment. Two separate apostolic witnesses, writing to two different audiences, both pointing back to the same ancient catastrophe. That kind of agreement across Scripture should stop us in our tracks. This wasn't a folk legend embraced by a few fringe scribes. This was understood, discussed, and treated as real history by the very authors of our New Testament. So here's the question this video is going to walk through, piece by piece. If the Watcher's plan was simply about desire, about beings giving in to temptation the way any of us might stumble, why does Enoch describe an oath? Why a pact sealed in advance, entered into with the full knowledge that judgment would follow? And why did it require a flood? Not a plague, not a famine, but a complete and total reset of the earth to stop what they had started. What was it about the Nephilim bloodline that made partial correction impossible? We're going to trace this from Mount Hermon to the Ark itself, through the words of Enoch, Jude, Peter, and Genesis. And by the end you'll understand why so many believe the flood wasn't only about washing away man's wickedness. It was about severing a corruption that had already taken root in the blood of the earth before it spread too far to stop. If this is the kind of study that speaks to something in you, that hunger to understand what Scripture only hints at in passing, then make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because we go deeper into these hidden corners of the biblical record every single week, places most teaching never touches. And if you want to hold this history in your hands, to sit with the full account of the Watchers, the giants, and the world that existed before the waters came, our companion guide walks you through it page by page, with illustrations that bring Enoch's descriptions to life in a way words alone can't fully capture. You'll find the link waiting for you in the very first comment pinned to this video. It's become something many in this community keep close, returning to it again and again as they study these things for themselves. Go check it out before you forget. It won't stay pinned there forever. Mount Hermon sits on the border between modern Lebanon and Syria, and ancient tradition never let that location slip by accident. Enoch tells us plainly that the Watchers descended in the days of Jared and swore their oath on its summit, which is precisely why the mountain carried its name. The place of the oath, some traditions render it, or the place of cursing. 200 beings stood on that peak and bound themselves to a decision none of them could reverse. That's worth sitting with for a moment. Angels don't act on impulse the way humans do. Whatever compelled them to make that pact wasn't a passing weakness. It was calculated, and it was collective. Picture the scale of it. Not two, not a handful, but 200 beings of immense power agreeing together on a single mountain to abandon their appointed role and step into rebellion. Later, Jewish and Christian writers would look back at Hermon's snow-capped ridge and understand why it carried such a dark reputation for centuries afterward, long after the events themselves faded into legend for most of the ancient world. The very geography of the region seemed marked by what took place there, a scar on the land that later generations still whispered about. Semjaza's fear tells us something important too. He worried the others might abandon the plan and leave him to bear the guilt alone, so he demanded they swear together, cursing themselves with mutual imprecations if any one of them broke rank. That's not the behavior of beings caught off guard by beauty. That's the behavior of conspirators who understood exactly what they were risking and chose to bind each other to silence and commitment before the first step was even taken. 10 leaders are named among them in Enoch's account: Semjaza, Urakabaramil, Akibil, Tamiel, Ramuel, Danel, Azkiel, Sarachniel, Asael, and Armaros, each commanding a portion of the 200, each responsible for what their followers would teach the sons of men. And what they taught wasn't neutral information. This is where the story stops being about forbidden romance and becomes something closer to industrial sabotage of an entire civilization, a calculated dismantling of the barrier God had placed between heaven's knowledge and human hands. Azazel, as we touched on already, brought weapons and warfare into a world that had never needed them at that scale. But the list goes further. Barakijal taught the observation of the stars, and here we have to be careful, because astronomy itself isn't evil. God set the stars in the heavens for signs and seasons, as Genesis 1 tells us. The corruption wasn't the knowledge. It was how that knowledge was twisted into divination, into fortune-telling, into placing human trust in the movement of stars rather than the word of the Creator who placed them there. Kokabel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. Arachiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun, and Sariel the course of the moon. Piece by piece, the Watchers handed humanity a complete system for reading the heavens apart from God, a rival source of authority that competed directly with the kind of trust Job describes when he speaks of the one who commands the sun, and it rises not, and sealeth up the stars. What the Watchers offered instead was a shortcut, knowledge without relationship, power without obedience, a way to know the future and manipulate the present without ever bowing the knee to the God who authored time itself. This is the piece that connects everything back to the plan. If you wanted to destabilize a young civilization still finding its spiritual footing after Eden, you wouldn't necessarily need armies at first. You'd need to hand people tools that made them feel self-sufficient, powerful, and independent from their creator. Weapons to dominate each other. Cosmetics and adornment to manipulate desire. Star reading to replace prayer with prediction. Every gift the Watchers brought down from heaven served the same underlying purpose: sever mankind's dependence on God and replace it with dependence on stolen knowledge. And then there's the offspring, which Enoch treats as the true engine of destruction. The Nephilim weren't simply large. Some traditions preserved in the Book of Giants, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, describe them as consuming vast quantities of food and still growing hungrier, until their appetite turned toward blood itself, toward beasts, and eventually toward each other. The text describes their dreams as troubled, visions of destruction pressing on them even before judgment fell, as though creation itself recoiled at what had been produced. Two of the giants, Ohia and Hahia, according to these fragments, receive visions warning of the flood to come, and even they seem to sense that something in the natural order has been so violated that it cannot be allowed to continue. There's something almost tragic in that detail. Creatures born from rebellion, sensing their own coming destruction in dreams they can't escape, caught between a nature they never asked for and a judgment they can't outrun. Numbers 13 gives us one more thread to pull. Long after the flood, when Moses sends spies into Canaan, they return describing the land as one that eateth up the inhabitants, and they report seeing the sons of Anak, which come of the Nephilim, so massive that the spies felt like grasshoppers beside them. However you understand that lineage surviving the flood, whether through a second incursion or a bloodline that persisted through Canaan, Scripture treats the presence of these giants as a live threat for the Israelites entering the Promised Land, not a myth safely buried in ancient history. The plan the Watchers set in motion on Hermon didn't simply end with the floodwaters. Its shadow reached forward for centuries, embedded in the land itself, waiting for Israel to confront it generations later on the very border God had promised them. Deuteronomy adds another layer here worth noticing. Moses recounts how the land of the Rephaim, another giant clan, once stretched across regions later occupied by Ammon and Moab, and how God himself destroyed them before the children of Lot, giving them the land to possess in their place. The pattern repeats again and again across the conquest narratives, nations of giants standing between Israel and the inheritance God promised, each confrontation echoing back to that original rebellion on Hermon's summit. It's as if the land itself needed to be cleared, not just of enemies, but of a corruption that traced its origin to beings who never should have left their post in heaven. Enoch himself becomes part of this story in a way most readers never expect. He isn't simply the author recording these events from a safe distance. According to the text that bears his name, the Watchers themselves came to him, terrified, and begged him to carry their petition before God, hoping the one man known for walking faithfully with the Almighty might plead their case and soften the judgment they could already feel closing in around them. Genesis 5 tells us Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. A strange, brief sentence that has puzzled readers for centuries, but Enoch's own account fills in what that walking with God actually involved, and it's far stranger than a quiet life of private devotion. He describes ascending in a vision, carried up past clouds and mist, until he stood before a house built of crystal, its ceiling like the path of the stars, and within it a greater house of fire, where one sat whose throne was like the sun, whose raiment shone brighter than any light, and whom none of the angels could approach. The description is overwhelming even on the page. Tongues of fire surrounding the structure, walls that shifted between ice and flame, a throne room so vast and so bright that Enoch himself says he fell on his face, trembling, unable to look directly at what he'd been brought to see. This wasn't a metaphorical encounter dressed up in poetic language. The text presents it as a real journey into the throne room itself, the same realm the Watchers had abandoned when they chose to descend toward Hermon instead. Standing in that presence, Enoch delivers the Watcher's plea, and the answer he carries back down is not soft. God tells him plainly that the Watchers, spiritual beings who were meant to remain holy and eternal, chose to defile themselves with the blood of women, begetting children with the blood of flesh, and lusting after what belonged to a different order of creation entirely. There would be no peace for them. No intercession would be granted. The judgment was already fixed. This matters because it removes any ambiguity about whether the Watcher's actions were simply misunderstood affection or something the created order itself couldn't absorb. God's own response, as Enoch records it, treats the union between angelic beings and human women as a fundamental violation of the boundaries built into creation from the beginning, not unlike the boundary between kinds that Leviticus later protects so carefully, or the separation between holy and common that runs through the entire priestly law. Some transgressions aren't measured by intention. They're measured by the damage done to the order itself. And this transgression damaged something at the root. And notice what happens next in the narrative. God doesn't simply strike down the Watchers directly and leave it there. Instead, he turns his attention toward what they created, the Nephilim, because the offspring themselves have become the greater threat. Enoch records the divine sentence against them plainly. Destruction is coming upon the whole earth, a flood, and it will destroy all that is on it. Everything Noah is about to build, everything that follows in Genesis 7 and 8, traces directly back to this moment. The flood wasn't a spontaneous decision born from watching humanity's ordinary sin spiral out of control. It was the specific, deliberate response to a specific, deliberate corruption that had already been judged in the heavenly council before a single raindrop fell. Genesis 6 gives us the human-facing version of this same conclusion. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. That grief is worth pausing on. This isn't a distant, unbothered deity flipping a switch. Scripture describes genuine sorrow, the kind that comes from watching something good become almost unrecognizable. And yet, in the very next breath, we find the one exception that changes everything. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Why Noah specifically? Genesis tells us he was a just man and perfect in his generations, and he walked with God, the same language used of Enoch generations earlier. But there's another detail tucked into that description that many readers skip past too quickly. Perfect in his generations. Some ancient interpreters understood this phrase as pointing to something beyond moral character alone, a genealogical purity, an unbroken human line untouched by the corruption the Watchers had introduced into the wider population. Whether or not you accept that reading fully, the text is clearly drawing a contrast between Noah's household and everyone else on earth. A contrast sharp enough that God chooses to preserve exactly 8 people while erasing everything else. 8 people, out of a population that had spread across the earth for over 1,000 years since Adam. Whatever the exact number of humanity at that point, the ratio alone tells you how thoroughly the corruption had spread by the time judgment finally fell. This is where the true weight of the Watchers' plan comes into focus. If their goal was simply personal indulgence, God could have judged them individually and moved on, the way he later judges individual sin throughout Scripture, without wiping out entire populations. But this required something far more drastic. It required starting over. The corruption had spread too far, penetrated too deep into the human population for anything less than total judgment to purify what remained. Peter later reflects on this same logic in his second letter, describing how God spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. Notice Peter's phrasing, the world of the ungodly, not simply a wicked generation, but a world so thoroughly compromised that only a single family carried forward what humanity was always meant to be. The ark itself becomes something more than a boat in this light. It becomes a vessel of preservation against a corruption that had infiltrated creation at a level no human effort could reverse. Noah wasn't simply escaping bad weather or fleeing violent neighbors. He was carrying the uncorrupted thread of humanity through the one judgment severe enough to sever what the watchers had started on Hermon generations before. A judgment that had already been declared in the heavens long before the first drop of rain ever touched the ground. When the flood finally came, it didn't simply drown the wicked. According to the tradition preserved in Enoch and echoed in Peter's letters, it dealt with the watchers themselves in a way that reshaped the spiritual realm for every generation that followed. Peter writes of angels that sinned being cast down to hell and delivered into chains of darkness, to be reserved unto judgment. The Greek word there is Tartarus, a term borrowed from beyond typical Hebrew cosmology, describing the deepest place of restraint reserved for the worst of rebellions. This wasn't a temporary timeout. Enoch describes the binding as physical and total, with the angel Raphael commanded to bind Azazel hand and foot, cast him into darkness, and cover him with rough and jagged rocks until the day of judgment, when he would be cast into the fire to be consumed. The earth itself in this account becomes the instrument of restraint, the very ground the watchers once walked upon in rebellion, now serving as the prison that holds them until the appointed hour. Semjizah and the others who bound themselves on Hermon's summit received a similar sentence. Michael is instructed to bind them for 70 generations under the hills of the earth until the day of their judgment, when they will be led away to the abyss of fire to torment, and to the prison in which they will be shut up forever. 70 generations is a striking number, one that shows up again in Daniel's prophecy about Israel's future, and in the genealogies leading toward the incarnation, and many who study this material believe it isn't accidental. The judgment against the watchers wasn't left open-ended. It was measured, timed, and tied to a fixed point in redemptive history, as though heaven itself had already marked the calendar for when this particular chapter would finally close. Some who trace the numbers argue this window lands remarkably close to the 1st century, the very era when Christ walked the earth casting out unclean spirits with an authority that seemed to unsettle them in a way ordinary human rebuke never could, as though something in that authority touched a judgment already scheduled long before. But binding the watchers didn't erase what they had already produced. This is where Enoch's account takes its darkest turn, and where the story stops being ancient history and starts explaining something readers still wrestle with today. The Nephilim themselves were destroyed in the flood. Their physical bodies couldn't survive the judgment any more than the rest of corrupted humanity could. But Enoch insists their spirits didn't simply cease to exist. Because they were born from the union of spiritual beings and human flesh, an unnatural hybrid the created order had never intended to sustain, their spirits became something else entirely once their bodies died. Evil spirits, wandering the earth, doing corruption and making desolate without hunger and without thirst, because they have no bodies through which to satisfy those needs, causing offense and fighting and breaking upon the earth, working affliction openly. If that description sounds familiar, it should. Much of the New Testament's language around unclean spirits and demonic activity maps directly onto this tradition, even where the gospel writers don't explain the backstory in detail. When Jesus casts out spirits who beg not to be sent into the abyss, when Mark describes a man possessed by a legion of unclean spirits living among the tombs, cutting himself with stones, the ancient audience hearing those accounts wasn't working from a blank slate. Many of them would have understood these spirits within a framework shaped by exactly the tradition Enoch preserves. Beings without physical form, remnants of a corruption stretching back to before the flood, still active in the world their bodies once dominated. It's worth remembering that Jude, in the same short letter where he references the Watchers directly, also mentions Michael the archangel disputing with the devil over the body of Moses, contending over territory and authority in a spiritual realm most modern readers rarely think about. The New Testament writers lived and wrote within a worldview that took this ongoing spiritual conflict seriously, even when they didn't stop to explain every detail behind it. This reframes something worth sitting with. The flood didn't simply end a historical problem contained neatly within Genesis 6 through 9. If this reading is correct, it explains why spiritual warfare and demonic activity remain such a consistent thread running through the rest of Scripture, from the wilderness temptations to Paul's warnings about principalities and powers in high places. The Watcher's plan didn't fully die in the flood waters. Its architects were chained, yes, restrained beneath the earth awaiting final judgment, but the spiritual fallout of what they created outlived the physical destruction of their offspring, seeping into the world in a different form entirely, one that couldn't simply be washed away with water. And this brings us back to Numbers 13 again, and the sons of Enoch the spies encountered generations after the flood. If Nephilim bloodlines reappeared after a global judgment specifically designed to eliminate them, something had to explain the recurrence. Genesis 6 verse 4 gives us the phrase that scholars have debated for centuries. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men. Also after that. Whatever mechanism allowed the Watcher's corruption to reach earth the first time, Scripture suggests it wasn't a one-time event, fully contained by the flood. Something of that pattern persisted, or repeated, long enough to leave giant clans standing between Israel and the land God had promised them, forcing an entirely new generation to confront what Noah's generation had already been judged for allowing to take root. It's a sobering thought that the very corruption a global flood was meant to erase found some way to surface again, embedded deep enough in the land and the bloodlines that Israel's conquest became, in part, a continuation of the same battle Noah's flood had begun. This is the piece that turns the Watcher's story from ancient history into something that shaped the entire trajectory of biblical warfare, conquest, and spiritual conflict that follows. Every battle against giant clans in Deuteronomy, every unclean spirit Jesus confronts in the Gospels, every warning Paul gives about wrestling not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual wickedness in high places, all of it traces back, in one way or another, to a decision 200 beings made together on a mountain long before Noah ever laid the first plank of the ark. What began as a conspiracy on a single peak became a fault line running through the rest of Scripture, resurfacing again and again whenever God's people crossed paths with what those Watchers left behind. Jesus himself points back to this exact period when he warns his disciples about the days ahead. In Matthew 24, describing the signs of his coming and the end of the age, he tells them plainly that as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came, and took them all away. Most readers hear that passage and think only of ordinary complacency, people going about daily life, unaware of coming judgment, distracted by the ordinary business of eating, drinking, and building families. But given everything we've traced through Enoch, Jude, and Genesis 6, there may be a deeper layer here worth considering. Jesus doesn't simply compare the end times to a season of moral carelessness. He compares it specifically to the days of Noah, the exact period when the Watcher's plan was unfolding at full force. If that connection holds any weight, it raises a question this teaching rarely gets asked directly. Was Jesus warning his followers about more than casual sin returning at the end of the age? Was he pointing toward a resurgence of the same kind of spiritual infiltration that defined Noah's generation? Corrupted knowledge, blurred boundaries between the spiritual and physical realms, humanity once again reaching for power and understanding outside the limits God set in place. Paul seems to gesture towards something similar in his second letter to the Thessalonians, describing a coming falling away and the revealing of the man of sin, whose presence will come with all power and signs and lying wonders, deceiving those who perish because they refuse to receive the love of the truth. The language of deception, of power displayed through signs, echoes uncomfortably close to what Enoch describes the watchers bringing down from heaven in the first place. It's not a stretch to notice the pattern repeating itself. Knowledge and power presented as gifts, offered outside the boundaries God had set, luring people away from dependence on Him and toward trust in something that looks impressive, but leads, ultimately, toward ruin. There's a reason this period in Genesis has fascinated readers and scholars for thousands of years, rather than fading quietly into obscurity. The ancient world itself seemed to preserve fragments of this same memory, even outside the biblical record. Sumerian tradition speaks of the Apkallu, semi-divine beings who brought civilization, arts, and forbidden knowledge to mankind before a great flood swept across the land. Mesopotamian flood accounts like the Epic of Gilgamesh describe a catastrophic deluge sent to correct a humanity that had grown too numerous, too loud, too troublesome for the gods to tolerate any longer. Different cultures, different names, different theological frameworks, and yet the same basic shape keeps appearing. Generation after generation, civilization after civilization. Corrupted beings, forbidden knowledge, a flood sent to erase what had gone wrong. Some who study this connection point to archaeological sites that predate what conventional history assumed possible for organized civilization. Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, with its massive carved pillars dated to roughly 11,500 years ago, sits comfortably within the window. Many place the pre-flood world, built by hunter-gatherers whose sophistication in stone carving and structural engineering shouldn't have existed according to the standard timeline of civilization's development. Baalbek in Lebanon contains foundation stones so massive that modern engineering still struggles to fully explain how they were quarried and transported. None of this proves the Watchers' involvement directly, and caution matters here. Speculation dressed up as certainty helps no one. But these sites do raise honest, uncomfortable questions about what human civilization was actually capable of before the flood, and whether the biblical account of angelic knowledge transmitted to early mankind offers a more coherent explanation than we've been taught to assume. Puma Punku in Bolivia and Sacsayhuaman in Peru present similar puzzles, massive stones cut and fitted with a precision that still challenges modern reconstruction attempts, scattered across continents that supposedly had no contact with one another in the ancient world, yet somehow sharing echoes of the same impossible craftsmanship. What makes this whole account so unsettling isn't simply the ancient history itself. It's the pattern it establishes, one that Scripture returns to again and again. Boundaries exist for a reason. The line between heaven and earth, between spirit and flesh, between divine knowledge and human hands, isn't arbitrary restriction dressed up as religious rule-keeping. Every time that boundary gets crossed without God's sanction throughout Scripture, catastrophe follows close behind. The Tower of Babel, another moment when humanity reached for something beyond its proper place, ends in confusion and scattering. The golden calf, Israel demanding a God they could see and control, ends in plague. Even Uzzah reaching out to steady the Ark of the Covenant, an act that looked reasonable on the surface, ends in sudden death because some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed regardless of the intention behind the reaching. The Watcher's story sits at the very beginning of this pattern, the first and perhaps the most consequential example of creation, stepping outside its assigned order and paying an almost unimaginable price for it. And it leaves us with the question this entire account keeps circling back toward. If God judged that generation so completely, sparing only 8 people out of the entire earth, what does that tell us about how seriously He takes the boundaries He's established for us today? Not as arbitrary rules meant to restrict joy or curiosity, but as protections built into creation itself, guarding something none of us can fully see the danger of until it's already unraveling around us. Revelation seems to circle back to this exact imagery near the very end of Scripture, describing angels who kept not their first estate being reserved in chains, a phrase pulled almost directly from Jude's own description of the Watchers. Whatever began on Hermon's summit, Scripture treats it not as a closed chapter safely buried in prehistory, but as a thread running from Genesis all the way to Revelation, tying humanity's earliest catastrophe to the very judgment still waiting to unfold at the end of the age. The story that opens with 200 beings breaking rank on a mountain closes, centuries of scripture later, with a final reckoning that finally settles what that ancient oath set in motion, a full circle spanning from the first pages of the Bible to its last. What began on a mountain with 200 beings and an oath still echoes through every page of scripture that followed, right up to the judgment still waiting at the end of the age. Thank you for walking through this history with us today. If these hidden corners of the biblical record speak to something in you, subscribe to the channel, hit like, and drop a comment telling us which part of the Watcher's story struck you most. And if you want the fuller account close at hand, the Watchers, the Giants, the world before the flood, brought to life in illustrated detail, the link is waiting in the first pinned comment below. Many in this community keep it close as they study these mysteries for themselves. Stay with us. More is waiting on your screen right now.